or so. We're going to give people time to come in from the waiting room. So while we're waiting for people to move into the room, I'm just going to briefly note a couple of logistical points. So firstly, we do have local language interpretation available for the Mekong countries. So if you would like to listen in Burmese, Thai, Khmer, Lao, or Vietnamese, please go ahead and click on the bottom of your screen on the interpretation button. It looks like a globe, and you'll see that you'll have the choice to pick for any of the audio channels, and we'll have interpretation throughout the event. So please feel free to jump into one of those channels if you want to listen in local language. Otherwise, we hope that throughout the discussion today, as you come up with questions, that you'll drop them into the question and answer box, which we will use to pull from for a moderated discussion at the end of the session. And I'll be keeping an eye out for any technical questions anyone has on getting into the interpretation rooms or anything else that arises. So with that said, thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm going to turn things over to our President and CEO, Brian Finley, to get us started.
Courtney, thank you so much, and a warm welcome to all of you tuning in here today. My name is Brian Finley. As Courtney mentioned, I'm the President and CEO here at the Stimson Center, and so we're going to have a lot of fun here today, this evening, wherever you are tuning in from. It's such a pleasure to have you all joining us. I know many of you likely for the first time joining a Stimson event, and we're especially grateful to have you first-timers here today. For your benefit, you should know that the Stimson Center is an international policy think tank that is focused on building uncommon alliances across geographic boundaries, across the artificial boundaries that exist between policy portfolios, all with the goal of promoting common security and prosperity around the globe. I should note that our work at Stimson is highly pragmatic. We don't just think big thoughts, we work with partners on the ground, with those directly in the field to implement the ideas that we generate here at Stimson. And there's no better example, I think, of that pragmatism than the work of our Southeast Asia team. Their work in the region, and particularly in the Mekong, has brought together partners, as you will see over the course of the next hour or so, really from around the world. And that work is guided by our partners on the ground in the region to promote transparency and to identify with our colleagues in countries up and down the Mekong those pragmatic and practical solutions. And just by way of example, I would commend to you our Mekong Dam Monitor, which has gone far, I think, to bring clear information to relevant stakeholders in the region and really around the globe. Our team does more, in other words, than just watch changes to the river. They promote really an impactful policy discourse in this town, here in Washington, in the region and elsewhere, that looks, I think, at a range of issues that are unfolding in the region, from pandemic recovery to climate challenges to stemming illegal flows of wildlife and other illicit goods. I think it's indicative of the import that we at Stimson place on the region. It's really, I think, the very definition, Southeast Asia, and certainly the Mekong in particular, is the very definition of what we at Stimson term a pivotal place. We see these issues from a regional perspective and call for greater engagement of bodies like ASEAN, development partners in the United States, and really around the world. And that's why we have convened today's high-level virtual event held in advance of President Biden's US-ASEAN Special Summit here in Washington later this week. It's a great honor for me to welcome a couple of folks who will help us kick off this dialogue. The Chargé d'Affaires of the U.S. mission to ASEAN, Kate Rebholz. Thank you so much, Kate, for your willingness to be here. It's an honor to have you, as well as Ambassador Bilahari Koskin, former permanent secretary to Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador, very grateful to have you as well. Thank you for joining us. They will join a panel of distinguished guests. You will see them on your screen here shortly. And of course, all of you to this discussion. And we really look forward to engaging you in a dialogue over the course of the next hour plus. My job now is to turn this discussion over to Brian Eiler. He is the maestro, not just for today's event, but he serves, as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, as the director of our Southeast Asia program. And Brian is someone who I admire greatly. He brings really an uncommon passion and commitment to the people of the Mekong. And Brian, thank you for pulling this group together for the discussion today, but also for your ongoing commitment to the Mekong. It is truly awe-inspiring. Brian will introduce our speakers and moderate the event. And ladies and gentlemen, with that, I give you Brian Eiler.
Thank you, Brian Finley. Brian and I have a running joke that you need to be named Brian to be a male and work at the Stimson Center, which is absolutely not true. We are the only two Brians at the Stimson Center. But Brian, it's great to have you tee off our event today, and we hope that you continue in our teamwork with our focus on the Mekong. Brian mentioned that we're not just going to discuss the river and what's happening to the river system today, but since this is ASEAN Week in Washington, D.C., and we're preparing for the special summit that President Biden is hosting with the leaders of ASEAN countries, we're going to take a bigger picture view of what's happening in the Mekong region, focusing on some of those issues that Brian mentioned, as well as thinking and recommending ways that ASEAN as an institution can better engage with the region, as well as ways that the United States can better engage with the region, and how the United States can engage through ASEAN to improve regional outcomes in the countries of the Mekong. Before we begin here, it's important to go over some house rules. One is, if you have translation needs, please feel free to select the interpretation button at the bottom of the Zoom console. You can listen in Lao, Khmer, Thai, Vietnamese, and Burmese. And we take pride in our ability to provide this translation, which is supported through funding from the Chino Siniego Foundation. Also, if you would like to pose a question to any of our speakers today, please use the Q&A function on the Zoom panel. We will be having a discussion portion at the end of the panel portion of this event, and we'll get to your questions then. You can pose questions to individual speakers or to the group. So let me introduce our keynoters. It's a great pleasure to have some really important thought leaders with us to kick off our event. First, we're going to hear from Kate Rebholz, who is the Chargée d'Affaires at the US mission to ASEAN. And she's just arrived in Washington, D.C. for the summit. Please forgive her if she's a little jet lagged, but we were speaking earlier and I think she's ready to go. Prior to arriving in Jakarta, Ms. Rebholz was economic counselor at the US Embassy in Moscow. She has served in a combination of State Department, domestic, and overseas assignments. In Washington, she worked in the Office of Korean Affairs on North Korea policy as the economic unit chief in the Office of India Affairs, as special assistant to the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, and as foreign policy fellow in the office of Senator Edward J. Markey. Kate, over to you for some opening remarks, and thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you to you, to both Brians, for this very warm welcome. Really, thank you to the Stimson Center for hosting this event on Mekong-ASEAN cooperation and how the United States can support multilateralism in the Mekong subregion. It's a well-timed topic coming just 2 days before the start of the US-ASEAN Special Summit. And I know the president is eager to meet with the leaders of ASEAN to discuss launching a new era in our partnership. In my work with ASEAN, I see the daily influence of the Mekong on the broader region. In the same way that ASEAN contributes to unity, prosperity, security in the Indo-Pacific, so does the Mekong subregion play a critical role in ASEAN's peace and stability. That's why the United States is so committed to strengthening capacity and resilience through the Mekong, because doing so is essential to strengthening the capacity and resilience of ASEAN. The US commitment to the Mekong is embodied in the Mekong-US Partnership, or the MUSP. The MUSP partners with Mekong states to address key challenges in Southeast Asia. This includes disaster relief, water governance and management, health and pandemic response, climate and the environment, energy, transportation, gender equality and equity. Focusing on these Mekong priority areas enables all of ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific region to thrive. By enabling multilateral institutions like ASEAN and the MUSP to work together, we set the region up for success. One way the United States supports ASEAN and the MUSP working together is through the Third Country Training Program, or TCTP, co-led with Singapore. TCTP is an MUSP program that provides technical training to officials from all ASEAN countries, the ASEAN Secretariat, and Timor-Leste. Technical experts from the United States and Singaporean governments provide their expertise through training on topics focused specifically on areas that are prioritized by the Mekong countries. And so, for example, to date, more than 1,700 ASEAN government officials have received training thanks to TCTP in topics ranging from water management to digital economy. This past September, we were proud to celebrate a decade of engagement under TCTP. Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Balakrishnan jointly renewed our commitment, and we were proud to include an arrangement that, per Mekong countries' request, at least one course per year will focus on issues relating to climate change and environmental sustainability. TCTP is one tangible way that the United States is working with ASEAN to promote capacity building in areas of enhanced regional connectivity and resilience, with a particular focus on the Mekong subregion. Other important parts of our work occur on a smaller scale. The Mekong Connections Program provides small grants to community organizations in Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam to explore creative solutions to transnational challenges. One grant through the Mekong Community Institute will engage with 50 women over the next year to document traditional knowledge and livelihood strategies. The project will also develop community-owned plans for civil society to protect river ecosystems, combat illegal wildlife trade, and study how changes in biodiversity and ecosystems affect human health. This work is a perfect example of how MUSP programming supports ASEAN, from fostering community engagement in the environment and public health to developing strategies to preserve traditional knowledge. These are important results for all ASEAN partner countries. This week's US-ASEAN Special Summit will build on these commitments by announcing new partnerships to support public health, climate and economic growth, and other opportunities in the region. The Special Summit and the MUSP demonstrate the United States' enduring commitment to ASEAN, recognizing its role in delivering sustainable solutions to the region's most pressing challenges. I hope everyone will stay tuned this week for what we expect will be many high-profile announcements and the release of an ambitious and forward-looking US-ASEAN Joint Vision Statement. The summit, the announcement of new initiatives, and the Joint Vision Statement all point to a United States that is committed to advance our multilateral work in ASEAN and the MUSP. We have an exciting few days ahead and many more exciting years to come. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. And we do look forward to that joint vision statement coming out at the end of the week and the announcement of new initiatives. And in fact, later in the discussion, I'm going to pose a question to the panelists. If you could design a new initiative for the Mekong, what would you design? Quick question, though, about some kind of hot issues that we're discussing in Washington. Some of the bigger picture policy issues, such as the Indo-Pacific strategy and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. Which seems to be in the development stages now. In your view, where does ASEAN and the Mekong fit into those larger strategic frameworks?
Sure. Well, that's a fantastic question. I think, as everyone knows who's read the Indo-Pacific strategy, you'd see that, the United States is committed to an Indo-Pacific region that is free and open, connected, prosperous, secure, and resilient. And we really see ASEAN at the center of the strategy in the same way that it is at the center of the Indo-Pacific region. I think if you look at the strategy itself and some of the key sort of elements of that strategy, advancing a free and open Indo-Pacific, we must partner with ASEAN to do that. And ASEAN has taken, its own steps through the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific to talk about how it interprets a free and open Indo-Pacific. And in many ways, we see both our Indo-Pacific strategy and their outlook as interconnected and aligned. We have endorsed their outlook or mentioned it in the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think that we look forward to working with ASEAN further to talk about how our strategy and the AOIP, can further and better intertwine and align. Through building connections in the region and beyond. I mean, that is an essential component of the work that we're doing with ASEAN. We are driving in prosperity in the region, and part of that, as you note, is through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But our work to, build prosperity in the region is not just starting today. We are building on decades of investments with the ASEAN member states and building, really further connections between our economies. Taken as a whole, the United States is one of the largest investors in ASEAN, and our private sector has already, really robust engagements and investments in the region. And so, our goal is to build on that and create through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, position all of these economies to be stronger for the future. And then, of course, we're building connections and working with partners, allies and partners in the region. And that's really part and parcel of what we're doing with ASEAN today and this week in the lead up to the special summit, and then, of course, and beyond. So I hope that gives you a sense of sort of how we view both the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and the Indo-Pacific strategy. But, for all of us, ASEAN is at the heart of our engagement with the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Kate. And for those listening in, I hope that provided some inspiration and food for thought on how you can contribute to the policy discourse here in Washington on how the Mekong and ASEAN can be more squarely and more effectively built into those policy frameworks. That's always welcome. And we know that people here in Washington are always open to listening to new ideas and opportunities. So thanks, Kate, for joining us, and good luck with the summit. We look forward to seeing you again at the Stimson Center sometime. Thank you.
Well, thank you again so much for this very kind invitation and the opportunity to speak to everyone. And I look forward to hearing how the panelists went and what great new ideas came out of some of these discussions. Thank you again.
Thank you, Kate. Our next keynote speaker is no stranger to Washington, D.C., and he's no stranger to the Stimson Center, as he has joined Bill Wise's Southeast Asia Forum on a number of occasions and joined us here at the Stimson Center for many other occasions. Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan really needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him an introduction. He's currently chairman of the Middle East Institute, an autonomous institute of the National University of Singapore. He has spent his entire career at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Singapore. And during his 37 years at the ministry, he served in a variety of appointments at home and abroad, including as ambassador to the Russian Federation, permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, and as permanent secretary to the Foreign Ministry. He has an education from Raffles Institution, the University of Singapore, and Columbia University in New York. Bilahari, over to you for some brief comments, and we look forward to your joining us in the discussion session later.
Thank you. Thank you to the Stimson Center. It's very kind of you to invite me to share my views on this important subject. But I'm here much more to learn than to pontificate, so I'll try to be as brief as possible in my opening remarks. To me, the significance of the upcoming US-ASEAN Special Summit is that it is being held. The meeting is the message. And it is being held while war is, alas, still raging in Ukraine. At the beginning of the war, some very superficial commentators predicted that it would distract the US from the Indo-Pacific generally and Southeast Asia specifically, as Afghanistan and Iraq had previously distracted the United States. Somehow, those holding this peculiar view failed to notice that it was Russia, not America, that was at war, and the war had placed its no-limits partner, China, in a very awkward spot. Putin spectacularly miscalculated, and Xi Jinping followed him into a strategic dead end with no easy exit. And holding the US-ASEAN summit at this time underscores what ought to have been obvious, that the US is in fact capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time and is not distracted. As for the content of the special summit, I think it is predictable, pretty much the usual issues on the ASEAN-US agenda, which we are all quite familiar with. Unfortunately, I think it is also a safe prediction that whatever else will be on the agenda, Mekong issues are unlikely to figure prominently, if at all. I hope I'm wrong. Nothing would delight me more than to be proven wrong in the next few days. Some months ago, I was told that the Biden administration was working on a Mekong initiative. I haven't followed up on what I was told. I don't know if this is true, or if true, where the initiative has gotten to in the bureaucratic process. But the US-ASEAN summit would be an excellent time to launch it if there's something to be launched. But I'm not holding my breath. Even if a miracle occurs and something new is announced next week, what we need is more than just another announcement. The first Obama administration, I think, as you all know, launched the Lower Mekong Initiative, and that was very welcome. But the second Obama administration lost interest in its own project. And it was only in its final months that the Trump administration took an interest in the Mekong. In other words, what we need from the US is consistent high-level attention that will signal that the US recognizes the strategic importance of the Mekong. Money helps, but it's not primarily a matter of money which can be provided by partners like Japan and Australia. But only the US can provide the strategic weight that comes with consistent high-level attention. You cannot expect your partners to cough up cash if you display only perfunctory or sporadic interests. I think a major problem is that the US tends to look at the Mekong piecemeal as a cluster of environmental or functional issues like water management, climate, and so on. And what we heard from Kate Rebos about the MUSP, I think illustrates that problem. It should look at the Mekong instead strategically and holistically within the overall Indo-Pacific strategy. I don't recall that the word Mekong rated even an appearance in the administration's Indo-Pacific strategy paper released earlier this year that Kate referred to. If I'm wrong, I apologize, but I read through it several times and I didn't notice that the word Mekong even appeared. Now, the US pays a lot of attention to the South China Sea, understandably so, given China's extravagant claims and aggressive behavior. But the land and the river that runs through it is as important as the sea, and indeed, arguably, more strategically important in the long run. Water is a strategic resource. China's dam building activities on its territory in the upper reaches of the Mekong and financing other dams in downriver riparian states give it a potential control over half of ASEAN. This could reshape the strategic geography of Southeast Asia and eventually reduce the significance of boundaries between southwestern China and mainland Southeast Asia to mere lines on maps. I don't think the implications of this need spelling out. A final point, and then I'll shut up. If ASEAN wants the US to take Mekong seriously, Mekong issues seriously and strategically, ASEAN must itself take Mekong issues seriously and strategically. We are far from taking it seriously or strategically. Chinese activities are not the only issue or the only challenge. Activities by ASEAN riparian states are also of concern, particularly Laos. The only time I have personally witnessed the Mekong raised at the summit level was in 2012, when it was the subject of a testy exchange between Cambodia and Laos. And that exchange lasted all of 3 minutes by my timing. There is also some ambivalence among ASEAN riparian states, particularly Thailand, about the extent to which they think the involvement of ASEAN non-riparian states in Mekong issues is desirable. So Mekong issues are usually discussed only at the sub-regional level and as narrow, functional, or technical issues. I don't think we can expect much progress in strategic consideration of the issue by the US or any other ASEAN dialogue partner until we in ASEAN get our own act together. And in this respect, I am not suggesting that we abandon the technical or functional approach. They are obviously important, but we need to set them in their proper strategic context as something that should be of concern to the whole of ASEAN and not just the Mekong riparian states. Now I'll already shut up and let the discussion proceed. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Ambassador. You've given us much to chew on. I really like your point of ASEAN needs to take the Mekong seriously and in a strategic, holistic approach as a way to amplify the efforts of development partners like the United States and to promote sustained engagement from the United States. I think let's look forward to the upcoming Shangri-La dialogue, where I know the Mekong issue will be on the agenda. I've got a paper coming out for the Shangri-La dialogue, and hopefully you can be there to raise that issue on the ASEAN, the regional agenda.
I'll be there. I'll be there.
Great, great. And please do stick around for our discussion. We're going to move to our panel now. I'm going to introduce our panelists together, and then very briefly, and then we're going to have brief presentations from each panelist. And remember, we're on the record today. If you listening in have a question, please type that question in the Q&A box, pose it to a particular panelist, including our keynote speakers if you would like, or to the group. Be specific to whom you are posing your questions. So here we go, some brief introductions of our four panelists, and this is the order in which you will present as well. First, we're going to hear some comments from Dr. Satu Lemay, who I think will kind of continue some of Bilahari's comments. Satu is a vice president of the East-West Center and the director of the East-West Center in Washington, where he created and now directs the Asia Matters for America initiative, and he's founding editor of the Asia Pacific Bulletin. He also works with us on a Mekong Matters for America publication, and we're due for another issue of that. So Satu, thanks for joining us. Next is Dr. Romyeong Kosaikonont, who's going to be joining us at the Stimson Center for a few months this summer as a Fulbright scholar. Dr. Romyeong is a lecturer in economics and international development at Mafa Luang University and is currently serving as center director at the Southeast Asia Ministers of Education Regional Center of Higher Education Development, also known as CMEO Riyadh. Third, on our panel is Sarah Collabdara, who serves as Executive Director of Legacies of War and is a good friend of ours and member of the Stimson Center's War Legacies Working Group. Legacies of War is the only international US-based advocacy and educational organization working to address the impacts of the American secret war in Laos and conflict in its neighboring countries of Cambodia and Vietnam during the Vietnam War era. And then finally, my good friend, Dr. Tin Tin Lê is going to, well, I'm going to call him Lê Dinh Tin, which is the proper way to address him in Vietnamese. He's currently Director General for the Institute for Foreign Policy and Strategic Studies and a board member at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. All right, let's go over to our panel for brief remarks, and then we'll get to our discussion. Satu, to you.
Well, good morning, Brian, and good morning, colleagues on the panel. Thank you so much for the invitation to join. Of course, we are very happy to partner with Stimson Center on the Mekong Matters for America publication and website, and look forward to a refresh of that. I'm going to just put it in the link for those of you who have not seen it. It's a resource for us to speak particularly to congressional staff and others who are less familiar with the issues than all the experts on this panel. So we hope you'll give us ideas to improve it as we think about a refreshed version. Let me make 3 or 4 big comments in the spirit of this theme of Mekong multilateralism. The first is the essence of the problem, which clearly is about the Mekong River, reduced water flows, the saltwater intrusion in the Delta. We all know that the technical experts have told us and explained that these are multi-causal problems and require multi-causal solutions. But it does seem to me that the main upstream dams issue and water control, as well as the climate change impacts, do come from one large country And I think we can't get away from that. And I think we need to be, very upfront about that. Somehow it's put off as the water flow problem is different from the climate change problem, but they're not really, to my mind, because the contributions to climate change also come from the same large state in the region. So my first point is there is a surely a complex, incredibly nuanced, multi-causal element of the challenges in the Mekong region, but we can also situate some of the problems fairly clearly. The second issue relates to the issue of what Bilahari raised, which is strategy of putting Mekong on the map, not only within ASEAN, but globally. And in the spirit of this theme of this conference on multilateralism, I would say there's three multilateralisms at work. One is the Mekong multilateral organizations themselves. We all know these, the MRC, the Mekong River Commission, ACMEX, the Lansang Mekong cooperation effort, many others, both functional and specific, as well as broadly regional. And the second element of multilateralism is the increasing number of allies and partners of the United States who are active in the region. And we've seen a definite and definitive uptick from Korea, Japan, Australia, to some extent India, working in particularly the Laos-Cambodia relationships, as well as Vietnam. And then finally, one we often skip over, but seems to me odd given the strategic importance, is the role of these countries at regional and global multilateral forums. So for example, Thailand is the chair of APEC this year. Cambodia is the chair of ASEAN. Vietnam has been recently a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. My point in highlighting these three tracks of multilateralism in the Mekong is that they all provide venues to create strategic importance to the region and to give attention to the issues. And they have not been, in my perspective or my assessment, properly and sufficiently used to do so. And that goes into the heart of some of the recommendations that maybe we can come to later that I would have. For example, I would propose that our allies and partners, starting off initially with ROK, Australia, and Japan, create a coordinated effort on the Mekong, both in terms of a donors element, but also in terms of a technical provision element, both to deconflict programs, but also to make them more efficient and more leveraged. So I think there are opportunities to be more, creative about the tracks of multilateralism that already exist without having to create completely new organizations. My final point relates to putting Mekong strategically on the map as well. And that relates to the future of ASEAN and US-ASEAN relations. The inherent issues in the Mekong, not only of the river and the technical issues of water and energy and environment, in particular ecology, but Mekong is also increasingly an element for great power competition. And that seems to me an avenue for strategic importance. The second is that the Mekong countries hold the promise of becoming increasingly important to key strategic issues such as supply chain resilience, and this will be important. Third, I think it'll be increasingly important for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and how that shapes out. And we'll need to think very carefully about which countries and on what issues, depending on what the IPEF or Indo-Pacific Economic Framework lays out, where these countries can be particularly brought in to IPEF and what makes sense for them, because that to me is an extraordinarily important strategic element. So let me just close by saying that I think the issues in the region are fairly clear, that there is one large country responsible both significantly for climate change impacts as well as water flow impacts. I think there are tracks of multilateralism that allow us to create venues for strategic importance to the region. And I think there are three concrete issues: IPEF, supply chain resilience, and great power competition, which inherently lend themselves to making Mekong much more strategic. So I thank you for the opportunity, Brian and colleagues, to join this panel. And I look very much forward to hearing the views of my fellow colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Satu. Thanks for making that linkage between upstream dams as well as climate change impacts and emissions from that large upstream neighbor. I think that gives a sense of responsibility for China to protect and respond and be accountable for those actions and engage with the Mekong countries in a more productive way by helping out in times of crisis. And we've seen these last 3 wet seasons as being extremely dry, and there's a need for more water downstream during the wet seasons to assist. But at the same time, I think this is a sense that pulls the United States in with a sense of responsibility too, to respond to climate change, mitigation, and resilience building, given that the United States is also the largest emitter historically. So there's a lot of cause, a lot of rationale for us to keep engaging productively in the Mekong. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Romyan Kasaikanot. Romyan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Brian, and greetings from Bangkok. And in this presentation, I would share my view based mainly on my experiences as an expert for the project Support for Capacity Building of the Greater Mekong Sub-Region University Consortium, or the GMSUC, supported by Japan ASEAN Integration Fund, and also as the Center Director of the Senior Right Head or the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization, specializing in higher education and development. And since its establishment in 1956, Senior Right Head has been working closely with the Ministers of Education to harmonize higher education and research, contributing also to the sustainable development of the region. Under Senior Right Head, which is comprising of the ASEAN 10 plus Timor-Leste, have a strategic plan to focus on 4 areas, namely the policy dialogue, leadership capacity enhancement, mobility and linkages, and knowledge maximization. And while working for the GMSUC, I recognize that there are gaps that needs to be narrowed in this diverse region. I have chosen the following top 2 on my list, which are, first, structural reform. Most GMSUC members and their respective governments are under the higher education reform process. And while physical infrastructure still needs upgrading, this has been clearer during the COVID-19 outbreak that the digital infrastructure and the qualified scholars to design and deliver virtual classes are lacking. And this creates a critical problem of the learning loss. More importantly, such soft infrastructure as quality assurance system, relevant programs responding to the future of work has also been interrupted. Second, human capacity enhancement. It is needed on 2 levels. They are the institutional leaders and the faculty and the staff. With the multiple crises we face, higher education has been questioned if it has done enough to generate relevant knowledge and prepare the learners with necessary skills. Higher education must lead the change and contribute to the sustainable development of the country and also the region. Now, if we are bearing these 2 key issues in mind, the second phase of the GMSUC Leadership Capacity Enhancement Program, we stresses on 4 areas, which are leadership and good governance, sustainable research ecosystem, innovative teaching and learning, and futuristic internationalization of higher education. But to implement each of these components, Senior Right Head is working with various partners for each component for the technical assistance, experts, and financial support. One good example I can share is the 4-year leadership project. We collaborate with the AAD, or the German Academic Exchange Service, focusing on the senior leadership and researchers through collaboration between Osnabrück University of Applied Science, Germany, and representatives of the GMSUC. And the project on leadership enhancement entitled The Horizon Southeast Asia, Pushing the Frontiers of Research and Sustainability was co-created. And I want to underline as well, employ a participatory approach, needs-based and action-oriented. Ultimately, with this collective learning, leaders of the GMSUC are expected to create the project that makes strategic changes at their institutions. And on the researchers level, 3 areas of research collaboration have also been identified, namely 1, climate change, 2nd, sustainable agricultural production, and 3rd is international river management. These three research topics are not only highly important and relevant to the sub-region, but it should foster research collaboration among the GMSUC, which should contribute into a meaningful supply of up-to-date findings and fact-based policy recommendation. So in my view, the US is committed to delivering many initiatives in the GMS and ASEAN, especially under both ASEAN-US Strategic Partnership and Mekong-US Partnership, Strategic Partnership to cover some key areas of cooperation in education and youth and human capital development. My question is, what can the US do more to address human resources and capacity needs in the Mekong region? And I think that the US may wish to consider the following. One, be more strategically engaged with the GMSUC in previously identified gaps of structural reform and leadership capacity enhancement for higher education development. The Asian issues would be addressed are the learning continuity through capacity building in innovative teaching and learning with digital transformation of higher education. Second, drawing on three strengths of the US for solid cooperation as follows. One is contribute through diversity, inclusivity, and equity, as the US has a strong positive mindset and experience in working on these themes. Second, proactively pursue actions towards SDGs to lead the change and tackle climate change through policy dialogue and leadership capacity enhancement. These can be in the forms of technical and financial support for regional research collaboration and sustainable research network. Engagement of experts from the US or the alumni of the Fulbright ASEAN-US program or the YSEALI, for example, can ensure a co-creation of relevant knowledge and fact-based policy recommendations. Third, share available resources and best practices to support the efforts of the Mekong initiatives. For example, Stimson Center's work on the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker, Mekong Dam Monitoring, and other data sharing platforms are good practices that can be shared with the leaders of the GMSUC in order to build a more solid higher education structure that is based on information sharing and collective intelligence. The sharing of data can also help support more impactful research in the area of international river management, sustainable agricultural production, and climate change, which is identified by the GMSUC. One last point, and I would like to mention it, that trust and sustainability are still crucial to successful cooperation in the region. The initiatives needs to employ more participatory approach from the design stage to the process implementation with clear outcomes and impacts, not just one-time events or completion of a checklist. Such a collaboration definitely would need active participation of regional organizations or the existing regional mechanisms for quality delivery of the overall efforts. Thank you. Brian, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramya. And importantly, I want to note that our next Mekong Policy Dialogue, the Track 1.5 Policy Dialogue series that we run with the Mekong-US Partnership, is going to focus on education and human resource capacity building. We're going to do it in the region, in Phnom Penh, barring any other challenges from the pandemic. But we hope to involve you in this and bring some of your ideas to that. Okay. Also, when you read research papers written about the Mekong region across a wide issues area, you often see a paper that's co-authored by, say, a Vietnamese author and an American author, or a Thai author and an Australian author, but rarely is there the paper that is co-authored by people from the region together, three countries, researchers working together to publish a paper with or without the assistance of a scholar from, say, the United States or another development partner. I think this is something that the US can strive for, to improve joint research by Mekongers and for the Mekongers to improve capacity building and improve results-oriented studies in the Mekong. So thank you for that intervention. Much to think about. Next, we're going to turn to Sarah Collabdara from Legacies of War. Sarah.
Great, thanks, Brian. I want to first say hello and sabaydi, especially to those tuning in from Laos, really late right now. So first, I want to wish everyone who recognizes and is celebrating AANHPI Heritage Month a very happy and hopeful Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. In the US, we celebrate AANHPI Heritage Month to honor and recognize the contributions and influence of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Americans to the history, cultural tapestry, and achievements of our country. As a Lao American, I'm intimately connected to the history between my birth country of Laos and my adopted and beloved country of the United States of America. Like many refugees and immigrant families, my family and I are not immune to the struggle for basic needs like food and shelter, nor did we escape racism and inequality. Today, I'm proud to lead legacies of war and serve Americans through building greater awareness about the American Secret War in Laos and broader Vietnam War era conflict in Southeast Asia. This is important because this part of our American history needs to remain at the forefront of American consciousness. We also advocate for our country to take ownership by removing the explosive remnants of war from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. As we approach the US-ASEAN Special Summit this week, I want to thank President Biden and his administration for making the summit a priority. Like Ambassador Bilahari said, this sends a clear message. There are many issues that deserve discussion during this gathering, and I urge President Biden and ASEAN leaders to make war legacies an issue, an agenda item, as it is a current humanitarian crisis and one that can be resolved. The war that the United States waged in the 60s and 70s in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos did not end for the people living there when the fighting ceased in 1975. An estimated 30% of the bombs that were dropped did not detonate on impact, leaving millions scattered across the three countries. Bombs like this one that I'm holding. Today, explosive bombs and mines still prevent the people from safely using their land to create better lives for themselves and for their families. The dioxin residue by Agent Orange, left by Agent Orange, continues to impact many tens of thousands of people who have been born with severe disabilities. These consequences of war limit human capacities, reduces the prospect for sustainable development, and adversely affect the safety and well-being of many families in the region. And it does not stop there. You heard my colleagues talk about climate change and other environmental issues. Explosive remnants of war also negatively impacts the environment through soil degradation, hazardous chemicals that are released into the air and the waters of the Mekong. It also imposes a risk to forest fires when bombs are detonated in dry areas, which can spread no matter where they start, as these countries are land linked to one another. Addressing these consequences of war is not just a humanitarian thing to do, it also creates opportunities for mutually beneficial partnerships, sustain peace, provide pathways to robust livelihoods, and improve diplomatic economic ties. Since 1979, starting with the Leahy War Victims Fund, the United States has provided medical assistance and livelihood support to the people of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia that have been injured by explosive remnants of war. In addition, since 1993, the United States has provided upwards of $657 million to Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam for humanitarian demining and mine risk education programs, which have helped to greatly reduce the numbers of deaths and injuries by explosive remnants of war. In fact, since Legacy started our advocacy of efforts in Laos specifically, There were accidents during 2008 were around 300. Now they're under 50 a year. As of 2020, the United States has provided over $300 million to help Vietnam address the legacy of Agent Orange. And for the first time in 2022, this year, the United States has allocated $1.5 million to provide support to people with disabilities in the areas that were sprayed by Agent Orange in Laos. So far, the US does not fund any work to address the impact of Agent Orange in Cambodia. In Vietnam, a quarter of these funds have been used to assist severely disabled children and young adults in 8 heavily sprayed provinces in central and southern Vietnam. 3/4 of the funds have been used to remediate dioxin hotspots at 2 former US military bases. The Da Nang airport is now completely free of dioxin, and dioxin remediation is in the early stages at Bien Hoa. Due to persistent advocacy efforts of Legacies of War, our partners and our supporters, I'm proud to share that current funding for UXO clearance for Laos is at $45 million, which is a historic high. For Cambodia, it's at $9 million and Vietnam, $19 million, all seeing increases. While I'm proud of America's leadership in demining issues so far, and I'm thankful for congressional champions that really care about these issues, the reality is this: the conventional weapons destruction account is facing a proposed $20 million cut. This is unacceptable. My team is dropping a link on our Twitter page right now. So if you click on it, you can tell your members of Congress that this is unacceptable and you want funding to continue to increase. As Americans, we must not go back on our leadership in this humanitarian issue. America can and must take bold steps forward. And there's 3 actions that I strongly urge our leaders to take. These actions will really show our commitment to the Mekong region. 1, make a firm commitment to being an ally to the people of Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. This is as simple as declaring that we will continue to increase US funding for UXO clearance, survivor assistance, and mine risk education work until we get the job done. Show that we will not forget about the people of these countries. Guarantee that funding will be made available each year and consult with key stakeholders and partner organizations like Legacies of War on the amount of funding, the needs and challenges. I know my team and I stand ready to assist, and I'm sure our partners do as well. Second is to take a firm stance on the side of human life and rights. Show the world that we will not allow children and their families to be harmed by indiscriminate weapons like cluster bombs and landmines. Announce and take steps to immediately accede to the Mine Ban Treaty and Convention on Cluster Munition. Put my friends and I at US CPL CMC, our US campaign to ban landmine cluster munition coalition, out of a job, and we will stop writing and making calls to you, Mr. President and team. We are now just beginning. Number 3, we are now just beginning to understand the extent of the impacts on the population and environment that were sprayed by Agent Orange and other dioxins. Because of the persistent efforts and research done by Susan Hammonds of War Legacies Project and her team, for the first time in history, there's an initial funding to address Agent Orange in Laos. We must continue to allocate greater funding to address health impediments, as well as other testings on how this impacts the environment in Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Now, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam are not the only countries in the region impacted by explosive remnants of war. Myanmar or Burma is also heavily plagued by landmines and other explosive remnants of war, some dating back to World War II. In 2020, there were at least 280 casualties. Over 90% of these casualties were civilians. Funding and expertise for humanitarian demining efforts is limited in Myanmar and Burma. and the country would benefit from support from fellow Mekong countries that have built capacities over the year, such as Vietnam. We know that cluster bombs and landmines are indiscriminate weapons designed to do one thing: kill now or kill later, and often, as we see within the Mekong countries, decades later. I urge all countries in the Mekong region to accede to the Convention on Cluster Munition in solidarity with Laos and the Mine Ban Treaty in solidarity with Cambodia. Now, I know Thailand is a part of the Mine Ban Treaty. Thailand could very well step up and also join the Convention on Cluster Munition and be the first country in the Mekong to sign both treaties. If the Mekong region is pledged to economic integration and sustainable development, war legacies issues must be resolved for progress to happen and the lives of the citizens in the region to be safe from harm from these legacy ordinances. In closing, the UXO issue and other war legacies issues are humanitarian issues that have a multidimensional impact on the Mekong countries and ultimately ASEAN. The US has taken leadership and ownership on war legacies issue and will only be able to make faster and more effective progress with help from the Mekong region and the broader support from ASEAN. Specifically, Thailand has a strong economy and is one of the largest investor and trade partners in Cambodia and Laos. Assisting Laos and Cambodia with UXO clearance is not only the humane thing to do, but also makes economic sense. These issues are current issues and should be addressed and resolved within the next couple of decades if we, meaning government, nonprofit, and other key stakeholders, give it the attention and resources that they deserve, which is long overdue. I hope that our leaders here in the United States and our allies in the Mekong and broader ASEAN will make this a top priority at this special summit and continue the conversation beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for making an argument as to why the war legacy issue area is one that should be a Mekong issue, a policy issue discussed here in Washington from a regional perspective. And I think that the US has a lot to lend in terms of capacity building and support, and again, a sense of responsibility to address these issues. And importantly, partners like Vietnam, who are well equipped to address these issues, can engage with Laos and Cambodia and help the United States engage in those countries in a more productive way. Thanks, Sarah. Now over to Dean from the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. Dean, I ask you to keep your remarks brief so we can get to a good discussion here for the final 16 minutes of our event. Thanks, Dean.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to the Stimson Center for having me. It's a great pleasure to join the panel with very distinguished researchers, policy practitioners, those who have a deep interest in the Mekong sub-region. I want to keep my remarks short for the Q&A, as requested by Brian. I have 5 points to make. Point number one, in terms of goal, the desirable goal that we're working hard to achieve in the sub-Mekong region, I don't think that we have a collective understanding of what should be the optimal goal for the sub-region if we talk to the different stakeholders who have a deep interest in the sub-region. But at least, I think for the overall goal, the overarching goal, I think everybody agrees that we really need a peaceful, connected, and sustainable sub-Mekong Mekong sub-region. So that's point number one. Point number two, in terms of the rules of engagement, in addition to the 1995 Mekong Agreement, I think that we also need to develop more rules and principles governing the activities in the sub-region, and also to take into account the fact that it's not easy to do so. So I think it's also significant to adopt best practices and even customs to make sure that the sub-region is sustainable, equitable, and work for everyone. Point number 3, in terms of the institutional arrangement, we do believe that any existing mechanism in the sub-region should contribute to the overall regional architecture. So the existing mechanism should work as the building blocks toward a more inclusive and open regional arrangement, which is, a very important part of the ASEAN community building effort, and which is part of the ASEAN desire to play a central role in managing and collaborating among the existing mechanisms in the sub-region. In 2022 chairmanship of Vietnam, Vietnam tried to add the Mekong onto the association agenda for the first time. Unfortunately, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, not many efforts have been taken ever since by the association to operationalize that collective efforts on the part of ASEAN. But ASEAN, I think, really want to play a central role in this process. Point number 4, in terms of resources, I think in addition to the homegrown resources of the riparian states, the roles played by development partners, such as the United States, China, the European Union, Japan, Korea, and others, also are very crucial, because the bucket list for the sub-regional countries is very long, whether it comes to climate change adaptation. For example, Vietnam needs at least $35 billion from now to 2030 for climate change adaptation. Supply chain, infrastructure, we have a long list of things that we need to do to ensure that the sub-region is sustainable and prosperous and peaceful. And finally, in terms of processes, I think for the Mekong to arrive at those desirable goals, a multi-stakeholder, a multi-dimensional process is needed, not a mutually exclusive or any sort of competition that might hamper the efforts of the riparian states and its development partners to work together, for the common interest of the sub-region and beyond. So I stop here for the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to open a kind of a hot take question to all of you, and it will be my only question. And I ask for quick responses, and anyone can answer this. It continues off of your line of discourse, Dean, and it asks why. Well, contextually, Ambassador Bilahari noted that there can be a more positive feedback loop established if the Mekong issue set is on the ASEAN agenda. And that positive feedback loop could be, between the United States engaging with ASEAN and deeper engagement, the Mekong, other development partners. A lot of productivity can come from this. What is it that prevents the ASEAN, that prevents the Mekong issue area or specific issues related to the Mekong from getting on the ASEAN agenda, and what can be done to elevate that priority? So this is a question to any of you, and again, brief answers are welcome.
Are you asking Bilahari?
Sorry.
No, this is to anyone on the panel.
Ken?
Satu, would you like to take a stab?
Well, the bandwidth of ASEAN is large, and in the 3 pillars, you would think the Mekong would affect all 3 pillars that ASEAN has identified. But what my sense has happened is that, as Bilahari mentioned, the focus has been on South China Sea, I think for 3 reasons. One, it's really visible strategically.
Right.
It's visible in a kind of way where you have new geographical features being built. You have images of vessels meeting each other or against each other. And third, you have an internationally bound issue. There's an international organization that rules on it. There's international waters inherent in it, and there's issues of great power competition in it. While the Mekong issues are profound, as Bilahari says, I think quite rightly, profoundly important for the future of not only the Mekong countries, but the entire viability and resilience of ASEAN itself. Talking about nearly 250 million people, huge economies, huge populations, urbanization, youth populations, etc. The fact is, erosive issues are less, erosive and corrosive issues in international affairs get less attention than potentially cataclysmic issues, right? Things that erode slowly, ongoingly, just simply get less attention. And so I think ASEAN doesn't put it on its agenda. I also think that there's one feature of Mekong issues that doesn't apply to South China Sea issues. That is, those international elements are not engaged. They become quite sovereign issues in terms of how you handle particular issues. Even though we know they're multilateral, the fact is they emanate from a much more sovereign basis than do South China Sea issues. At least those are some of my perspectives since you asked. Thanks.
Thanks, Satu. Others?
Let me just add one point to what Satu said, and I quite agree with him. Huh? Can you hear me, by the way?
Yes, but we can't see you.
I don't know. I can't turn on my video for some reason.
Okay.
Because the host has stopped it. The host has stopped it. Anyway, just, you know what I look like, right?
Yes.
No, I just add one point. I agree with everything Satu said. I add one point. I reiterate a point I made in my opening remarks. There is a certain ambivalence among the riparian states about how much they want the other ASEAN countries to get involved in the Mekong issues. That's a fact. It's there in Thailand, less so in Vietnam. There is actually a potential international framework for dealing with this. There is a UN convention about non-navigable uses of rivers. I can't remember the exact title, right?
UN Watercourse Convention.
That's right. But there's only one ASEAN country, one Mekong riparian state that has signed on. That's Vietnam. I don't understand this. It's very odd to me. You would think that small countries, it would be in the interest of small countries confronted with a much larger country to try to broaden the issue, internationalize the issue. But the reverse has been true. It's a mystery to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Bilahari. I'm going to go to the questions that are coming in from our audience. And again, please keep your responses brief. This one is not to anyone in particular. It comes from Naifa Rizani. And she says, or he says, they say, knowing that increasing the role of ASEAN is important to the development of Mekong region, we also see that there are still gaps of interest among Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, the grouping that's commonly known as CLMV, and non-CLMV countries within ASEAN towards the issue. So gaps between CLMV and non-CLMV countries. Why do you think there's a lack of interest from the CLMV countries to articulate the need to elevate this issue set onto ASEAN? And what can be done to bridge that gap?
I can do this one. Personally, I think because countries like Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam are still plagued by the war legacies issue, if you can't get past that, if you can't even get past the safety net of like getting food for your family, safety, having your kids walk to school safely, how can you think of anything else? It's just basically like Maslow's law. Short answer, Brian.
Thank you. Others?
Yes, Brian, if I may share from the higher education harmonization process, in the region, we are trying to work on, well, in the world, we have the Global Convention, which is advocated by the UN, the UNESCO. And what they are trying to do is to have a standard of what is being recognized on the degree. And I can see that, some countries in ASEAN are interested in that. And I would second what Sarah said, for the CLMV, they cannot get past the foundation, laying out the foundation for higher education systems in the country. And how could they talk about something, bigger, sort of like on the standard, on the global standard? That's one. Second, on reverse, I also see that perhaps the countries in the ASEAN is not so interested in trying to bridge the gap in the CLMV. And I think partially because they don't really perhaps not understand and perhaps also don't see the benefits of how, the contributions in the CLMV would give them the benefits. But, all in all, I think there is a gap that needs to be bridged.
Thank you, Romyan. Another question from Uday Banu Singh, who asked—
Can I jump in real quick?
Sure, please, Dean. Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. So I guess the question of lack of awareness is still there.
Mm-hmm.
I always try to make the case, for example, for my colleagues and friends in the Philippines, that your food security is partly guaranteed by the food provided by the Mekong River. And the Mekong Dam. And Singapore has a lot of investment projects down in the southern part of Vietnam. So you have an intertwined interest in the sub-region. But we need to do a better public diplomacy campaign, I guess, to narrow this gap. And I also want to really quick to catch up on the last point made by Satu. There's no freedom of navigation in the sub-region, per se. All right, so it's very much sovereign-based and highly sensitive when it comes to transboundary cooperation. So that is something that we should be aware of.
Tim, thanks for making that point. That's exactly the point I was making, was that it does not involve international. And so to invite international input into this has to be done carefully to protect sovereign. And those countries in the Mekong are particularly acutely sensitive to sovereignty issues, even more so than elsewhere. So I'm glad we're in agreement, not surprised.
So back to that, and this will be our final question from Uday Banu Singh. Satu, you spoke of the role of US partners and allies in the sub-region, including India's role, and I'm going to add the Quad as something to consider. Would you like to elaborate on the role of US partners in the sub-region, and if this is likely to figure into the summit's outcomes and discourse?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much for the question and the opportunity to reply. As I put in the chat, a report that we did on a Mekong conference, which included a number of stakeholders in the region, both obviously the countries of the region, NGOs, civil society organizations, educational organizations. Brian knows well about this. He spoke at the meeting. But then, of course, other countries too. And one of the things that we have empirical evidence on is that countries such as Japan, ROK, Australia, India, and others have increased their activities, ecological, energy, environmental, developmental aid to the region. Now, so that's true. And I think there's an opportunity here for the US as it continues to develop what I call a transition from wheels and webs to more wired regional multilateralism. And we can work with some of these allies and partners in the Mekong region to coordinate our efforts on such issues as ecology and environment and energy and development. And India has clearly increased to CMLV countries, has traditionally focused its ASEAN efforts on those countries for historical reasons, for developmental reasons, for appropriate technology reasons, especially on things like software training, et cetera. So these are not, India also faces, I might just add here to the questioner, as you well know, similar riparian issues with a big upstream neighbor on the Brahmaputra River. So these are issues that are not unfamiliar to India, both in the Indus system and the Brahmaputra River system. And finally, on the Quad, I think there are opportunities. The Quad has a lot of agenda items to do. but whether it can add Mekong in the basket of its issues on development and ecological and environmental, it would seem to me sensible to do so, but not to detract from its immediate priorities, which is pandemic provision, health provision, and recovery, and those kinds of issues. But certainly that could be something that could be taken up in due course. Thank you.
Thank you, Satu. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. You know, there are more questions that are populating the Q&A box here, and we wish that we could get to them. We're going to look at them. We're going to share them with our panelists, and if we can, we'll share them with you, because, you know, we search for ways to elevate the Mekong issue set, the broad issue set, onto the ASEAN agenda, as well as onto the U.S. foreign policy agenda for the Indo-Pacific and the Mekong. So I want to thank you all for joining us. We want to encourage you to continue contributing ways that this important issue area can be elevated on those agendas. We ask you to think creatively and innovatively. I think, you know, having Sarah here today to talk about war legacies issues is one of those possible innovations that can also deepen United States engagement in core Mekong countries like Laos and Cambodia. Everyone, please continue to watch the proceedings of the US-ASEAN Special Summit happening this week. It's on Thursday and Friday. There are several events that you can attend virtually or in person in Washington starting tomorrow, in addition to this one and perhaps some later today. Let's all look forward to that joint vision declaration that comes out, and some big announcements about some new projects and initiatives for the ASEAN region and hopefully the Mekong. Thank you all for joining. Thank you to our panelists for calling in from all points of the world. It's been a real pleasure.